Hey guys, all right. My name is Justin. Um, I'm with Fluent Guitar here. Today, I just want to start this series off with the most basic fundamentals and foundations for learning and playing music and understanding. These are the things that I teach all of my students and make sure that we have a thorough understanding of the concepts of rhythm and music in general so that we can build off of that and continue learning new skills that will always relate to these foundations and these fundamentals. So the very first one here, of course, is rhythm. Rhythm is the backbone. It is the foundation that everything in music is built upon, at least most music that most of us want to play and listen to. Um, a good understanding of rhythm is super important. And I have a lot of students that come to me after learning on their own or even with other teachers and trying to learn off of YouTube and stuff, where rhythm tends to be the number one thing that most of them struggle with and cannot seem to comprehend in a practical way. Like some of them might get and understand the basics of rhythm, but they don't understand how to apply it to actually playing. And so that's where we begin here in our method. And I wanted to kind of quickly go over the basics of music, of rhythm, and the components, and kind of give an overview so that you can learn to start um, applying it pretty much directly. The first thing to understand again is rhythm is the foundation for everything. I often use the story of a train kind of system, right? If we want to have a train moving along, we got to have the tracks, and that's what the rhythm. That's the role that rhythm plays. It is the tracks that the train is moving along on, and the train is the song or I liken it to the chords, for example. Um, so chords and rhythm are very interlinked and related here. But rhythm again is fairly basic, and everything we want to do in music should relate to listening to it, feeling it, and listening to it. So one of the first things I tell students especially who come to me with a little bit of experience and they've tried things out and just can't quite get that rhythm to click. Um, One of the first things I tell them is, and I ask them actually, is are you trying to strum or use strumming patterns, right? Are you looking up songs or looking up YouTube videos and they're trying to give you the ups and the downs of the strumming patterns? And that tends to be a big misconception. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is stop looking at strumming patterns. No musician I know plays strumming patterns. We don't think in strumming patterns. We don't play strumming patterns. I don't read strumming patterns in order to play. Um, Strumming patterns are good to kind of understand details after the fact. If you already know and understand rhythmically what's going on, then you can use strumming patterns. But generally, what you'll find is if you have a good idea of how rhythm works and how it works in your playing, you'll never really need a strumming pattern written out for you. You just simply listen to it and figure it out. Okay, and it's a lot easier than a lot of people realize. So the first thing we got to do is, just like any new endeavor, you have to understand the terminology, because if you understand the words that we use, the definitions of the words that we're using, um, the concepts are tied to that, right? So we can speak the same common language, but also get the ideas that we are all familiar with as musicians. So the first is going to be, I'm going to define a few terms that are related to music, related to rhythm, and then we'll talk about how to hear it, and then also talk about how it maps onto the technique of actually strumming. Okay. Now, the first thing that we'll have to talk about is what we call the pulse of a song. Okay. Now, the pulse of a song is really simple. Most of us do this subconsciously. We do this when we're listening to music. We don't even realize we're doing it half the time. And that is, you put a song on And what do we start doing? We start nodding our heads or tapping along, snapping our fingers, clapping along, stomping along. Okay. It's the feeling you get that you want to tap to in a song. Now the pulse, okay, so that's simply how I define it. It is literally just that feeling, the regular continuous feeling that you get, how you act out when you're listening to a song. Um, Now, a pulse is pretty general. It's not going to necessarily help us play yet, because as we'll see in a minute here, a pulse isn't the same. I'm going to differentiate that. It is not always the same as what we call the beat or the count. Okay. Um, and so, but it is a good place to start because it tunes you in to the song you're listening to. It gets you in that rhythmic flow. Okay. And so you want to as musicians, we want to pay attention to those feelings that we have. That music should make you want to move somehow, right? And so that's what we're going to define as the pulse. It's our entryway into hearing and feeling rhythmic components in the music. So you can practice a lot of these things, by the way, without a guitar, right? Rhythmic listening, and you can act it out, and we'll soon see that I often recommend vocalizing out rhythms as well, just to help us make sure that we're really hearing it and we understand what we're hearing. So that's pulse is first. The next thing we have to define then is beat. What is a beat? Right now, colloquially, most people use beat as what I just defined as the pulse. But we're going to define the beat a little more succinctly. And the beat is going to be the same. It's going to be synonymous with count. Okay. So the beat is actually what we're measuring when it comes to songs. Okay. When it comes to things like chord changes and the song structure and stuff like that. So that's really important to understand. Okay. So a beat is the same as the count. And the count, of course, is how we measure things in music. So if you're completely new to music, you might not understand. You might have heard these words like measures or bars. That's the next thing. So a measure is literally a set number of beats or counts that is cyclical. So that that's how we divide the feeling of the music rhythmically. So the most common measurement we have in most music is 4 beats per measure. So we would count 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we'd start the count over again, and we'd say that cycle of 4 beats is 1 measure or 1 bar. Okay, so very important to understand logically what these things are. So beat again is the same as our count. Okay, so this is now what we're going to do here. We're going to have to figure out, well, how do I understand what my beat is? If I said my tapping is not always the same as what I would call my beat or my count, that's just the pulse. Sometimes it can be the same. Oftentimes it's not the same. They're related, but they're not. That we're not counting the pulses, but we are going to count beats. So how do I tell what the differences are? So this is where the knowledge comes to help you play, and you want to listen for this stuff. Again, you got to make it make sense to your ears here. So beats in the structure and the sound in music, so that is built around weak beats and strong beats, and a pattern of weak beats and strong beats. And the strong beats we call accents. Okay. And so if I have a typical 4/4, what we call a 4-count measure, so 4 beats in a measure again, we're going to have the typical weak beat, strong beat, or accented rhythm that we hear and feeling that we get is this. We're going to have a weak beat up front, a strong beat, and then we repeat that. So weak, strong, weak, strong. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So we accent the 2 and the 4. So it's every other beat, starting with a weak beat, every other beat starting on that second beat is a strong beat. So if I counted 2 measures, it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Now, accents and how we portray the accents, how we actually make the accents sound, right? We feel those accents, right? And so those that if I clue in, if I listen in and focus in on those the accented pattern, where are those accents? Can I anticipate that when I'm listening? Now I know what I'm actually measuring. I'm actually cluing into how fast my beats are. Where are my beats actually taking place? Okay, and a good demonstration of between difference between pulse and beats is simply this: if you have a song that's a little bit faster, count. Okay, we're gonna count it. The count itself, like I said, is gonna be fast, but the pulse is probably gonna be slower, usually half of what the actual count would be. And why is that? So if I play something like this, okay, most of us, my beat would be boom, chuck, chuck, boom, chuck, boom, chuck, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? It's pretty fast. Now, if I'm just a listener and I'm listening to that and I'm trying to feel that pulse, I'm not going to be right. I'm not going to be tapping along to what the beat actually is, because it's a lot of energy. Most of us don't want to do that. Most of us are going to sit there and do this, right? And either count tapping on the accented twos and the fours, or the unaccented, the weak beats on the ones and the threes. Okay, and the pulse will be every other beat, because that's more of a natural tempo or speed to tap along to. And it's still related to that count, right? It's either on the one and the three, or the two and the four. And so we're on the count, but we're only doing every other beat, because it's not natural to sit there and do this unless it's a really energetic song and we're really feeling it. But most of us are not going to do that. Okay, so that's a really good example again of differentiating why we call that feeling of how we would naturally tap to something the pulse, versus cluing in a little layer further, the beat would be double the pulse in that one. Okay, and again, I know this because I hear boom chick, boom chick, boom chick. Now, I'm going to introduce the main technique to really cluing into listening to where the count is, where the accents are, and that is the boom and the chuck. So boom would be on the weak beats, chuck would be the strong beats, and you can see kind of an onomatopoeia there. Chuck has a stronger attack to actually saying the word, right? So if I play this. Boom chuck, 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 boom chuck. Right, like I can vocalize along, and it maps out. Okay, and so to practice this, you want to have a song when you're listening to a song. You want to try to see if you can focus in and catch that beat cycle by trying to vocalize to it simply with booms and chucks. Okay, you have to find the boom chuck pattern in any song. Those are your beats, those are your counts. That's how we're measuring chords going by, and phrasings and song structures, and all of that. Okay, everything relies as a musician on finding the weak beat, strong beat pattern, the accented pattern. Okay, so a typical 4 beat would be, again, boom chuck, boom chuck, boom chuck, boom chuck, boom chuck, boom chuck, over and over again. Okay, thinking in groups of 4 there. Some other common counts. Another common count would be, for example, 3, and that has a pattern like this. And you can hear that as a boom chuck chuck, boom chuck chuck, boom chuck chuck, boom chuck chuck. Okay, again, cluing into the booms and the chucks. Boom, chuck, chuck, boom, chuck, chuck. So groups of 3 in that case. And of course, each measure then has those 3 beats, we would say. And you can clearly hear the cycle is 3 beats, and then we start it again and repeat it and repeat it. Boom, chuck, chuck, boom, chuck, chuck. Okay. So that's the very basic idea of how to count and listen for the beats. Okay. In any rhythm. Now, what I often tell my students for playing a rhythm is we're going to play all of the beats. And eventually we're going to fill in and play. We'll go a step further, and what we'll play is the subdivisions, what we call subdivisions. So if I divide those beats, if I think of, I've already divided the measure, if I'm going back to 4, into 4 beats. So we're going to call those quarter notes, right? They're each worth a quarter of a measure. Okay. The other idea, though, is I can further divide those quarter notes, okay, and play in between them, especially if it's a slower song and I have enough time to do that. So if I divide quarters in half, I get eighths. Okay, and we're going back to the grade school fraction math here. So if quarters get divided in half, they go to eighths. Okay, now, well, we're going to talk about mapping our technique to how to play all of these beats in a second here, but I want to go a little further. So eighth notes are the next layer, and then we can go another step, and we can keep going. But typically, most music is in this realm here of quarter notes, eighth notes, and then if I divide eighth notes in half, I get 16th notes. Okay, so now each of those beats, each quarter note is now divided on eighth notes. I get 2, right? And we say 1 and, or boom and, okay? And then if I divide it into 16ths, each beat gets 4, right? So now I have 16 beats in my measure. So we count that 1 E and a, 1 E and a, 2 E and a, 3 E and a, 4 E and a, okay? Or boomy and a, chucky and a, boomy and a, chucky and a. Now what you'll see in here is that I'm continuing, instead of counting 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm saying boom and chuck at the beginning of each beat, so that I keep my orientation and I hear it and I feel it, weak beat, strong beat. Okay, much better mentally, instead of counting along, to boom chuck along. Keep it as a musical sound and thought in your mind. There's something about the brain. If we start counting, as simple as that might seem, it just activates different parts of the brain that we don't want to use. It's too much thinking, basically, for our brains to handle when we're trying to actually play music. We want to be in a musical frame of mind, and so we want to think in musical thoughts. So boom chuck is much more musical than 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so a little trick for you while thinking in terms of beats. Okay, and with practice, you get used to kind of understanding how many measures are going by without having to count it out too. Okay, and in another video we'll talk about that when it comes to like chord changes and things like that. But so for today, again, we have the pulse, we have the boom chuck, which is our count or our beat cycle, and then we have the divisions of our counts, the subdivisions we call them. So quarter notes go into eighth notes, go into 16th notes. Okay, now let's talk about how to actually play this stuff. So if you're completely new, okay, what I recommend is learning, and again, there'll be another video about chords and the left hand and stuff, but play a single string or I recommend for most students, it's better to start off with some form of a chord, just because it's a little more musical. You can do more things with it rather than a single note. You'll see a lot of method books start with single notes. There's a lot of reasons for that. I tend not to do that with most students unless we have to. Some students we do, but most of the time, if you can press a string down good enough and hold a shape in your hand, you should start with learning chords. And so chords allow you to just hold a shape. Okay, so this is a G chord, for example, and strum, right? Strum across all the strings, or however many strings are actually involved in the chord. Okay, so we'll talk about picking technique, how to hold a pick and strumming and everything a little bit here today, but we'll have a further video, in-depth video later on. Real quick, the main action from strumming should come from your wrist. Okay, so that if I want the action to come from wrist and not my arm, the main points are elbow should be disengaged, meaning if I'm hanging over my guitar with my elbow, I'm probably naturally going to want to move from the elbow because now it's available to move from there. And you can get away with it. You'll see guitarists do it. Like I can still move from my wrist, but it actually makes it a little harder not to move from your arm like this. Okay, so take the arm, that elbow movement out of the equation by bringing the elbow back behind the little precipice here on the edge here, right? And so you can kind of hang and dangle from there, and now you're moving from your wrist kind of more automatically. So that's tip number one. Tip number two is, if I have tension in my wrist by having tension in my fingers by trying to, for example, to squeeze in my fingers the pick, it's going to create tension in my wrist, which is going to again activate this need or desire, this feeling to want to move from the elbow. Okay, and we don't want that. So we want to keep a loose grip on a pick, keep our fingers nice and loose so that our wrist stays nice and loose. Okay, so there's a kind of a specific grip that helps us do that. Real simply, again, if you think of this, if I stick my thumb up and put my fingers relaxed here, I put the pick, I'm holding the pointy end on top of the side of my finger here, so I can kind of still move it kind of like a trigger here, right? And then thumb on top of that. So I should still be able to move my finger. So I don't want to pinch my pick because again, it restricts movement in my wrist. So I want this grip here where I'm on the side of my finger, okay? Pretty straightforward, pretty basic, but takes some practice. The main idea for strumming, okay, as it comes to rhythm, is I'm going to hold a chord, and on the beats, so on the quarter note beats, whatever we determine the speed is, so on the boom and the chuck, those are always going to be down strums. There are few exceptions to that rule. If they're really hard to find, to tell you the truth. If you are listening to something and trying to play to something, if you find the boom chuck pattern and you match your down strums to that boom chuck pattern 9.5 times out of 10, that's going to give you the sound that you're hearing in the song. That's going to put you on the right path to actually strumming what you're hearing in the song. Okay, so we're going to line up our down strums with boom and chuck. Okay, but again, in our playing, we have to get the difference between the sound and the feeling of boom and the sound and the feeling of chuck, the accented beat. Here's a little pro tip for you. How we mostly do that, especially on an acoustic guitar, but even electric guitars and other strumming instruments, is we have low sounding strings, these three, what we call the bottom three strings, even though they're on top, but because they're bottom because they sound low. And then we have the top three strings, the higher sounding strings. So we have this difference between a low sound and a high sound. And the high sound, because it has higher frequencies, kind of cuts through a little bit sharper, has that chuck kind of sound or feeling to it. So boom would be the low strings, and chuck would be the high strings. So a little technique involved here, but basically trying to only hit like these 1, 2, 3, maybe 4, maybe even 5 strings, but definitely avoid that first string down here. And then on the booms and then on the chuck, you definitely make sure you hit and include that first string on the chuck. And usually we play like 4 strings with that. So, and this way, your technique doesn't change. You just place the pick differently so that you're not having to go, right? That would be kind of a lot of guitars start that way, where they have to think you have to play all 6 strings. If my chord has all 6 strings all the time. And so how do you try to get accents? You try to just strum harder on the chucks. You can hear that difference. It's not subtle and it doesn't sound that great. Music is more nuanced than that. So a little pro tip again is play the difference between low and high, low, high, low, high, low, high. Okay. And again, that's our boom, chuck, boom, chuck. Or if we're measuring 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So that's our pro tip for the day when it comes to strumming. So if we map out our booms and our chucks by our ears and by trying to vocalize them out, then we try to play them by low, high, low, high. Once I find them, now we're up and running. And if you're completely new to guitar, that's as far as you should go. You should stay there and practice that for a bunch of different songs and different chords and just different, making sure that you can, the real practice is making sure you can hear that boom chuck pattern, find the boom chuck pattern, try to vocalize it, and then try to play along. And if you don't know any chords, you can still practice this with songs, any song that you don't know chords to. You just simply mute the strings by lightly touching it somewhere, and you can practice your technique and just staying in rhythm, staying on the beat with your technique. Okay. So that's the main idea for today. Again, it's all about the boom chucks. Okay. Everything is going to hinge, everything moving forward is going to hinge on this idea of what we define as the beat, those boom chucks, and learning how to listen to them and find those boom chucks on your own there. Of course, having a guide can help you. One other real quick tip is that some of you might be coming from different musical backgrounds, or you might have a little bit of understanding of how drums work, for example. If I was a drummer, I'd have the basic drum kit would have a kick, where I literally use my right foot for that. And then I have a snare here, and then a hi-hat, of course, here. But basically, a basic drum beat would be kick, snare, boom, chuck, boom, chuck. And this is doing the subdivisions usually. Okay. Now I mention this because some of you might be listening to music with drums in it. Of course, a lot of music has it. Okay. And it has that basic drum beat to it. Now, as a guitarist, we have to determine, is the drummer playing our boom chuck, playing the boom chuck that the chords and everything are moving along to, or are they on a slightly bigger or smaller arc than we are? And because drummers have slight kind of different rhythmic games that they're playing. A lot of the times, thankfully, their boom and chuck are going to be the same as our boom and chuck. But in certain styles of music, for example, really obvious example comes from reggae. Reggae music, the chuck you hear is, first of all, a lot of the times the guitar and keyboard are doing the chuck, and they're only playing the chucks. They don't play anything on the boom. It's what we call the skank in reggae. And you'll hear the right? And so you know, boom, chuck, boom, chuck, boom. Now sometimes the drummer will be doing that off, but oftentimes the drummer is half of that speed. Their boom chuck is actually half the speed of that. Okay. Again, for playing purposes, we're going to be measuring what the keyboard and guitarists are doing and thinking of their boom chuck. And so we have to kind of feel what the drummer's doing, but understand that their boom and their chuck is not going to be the same as ours. But in a lot of other music, it is going to actually be the same. So that's a little clue for you too, depending on the style of music that you're into and trying to learn here. But for a lot of things, the boom chuck is obvious in a lot of music. So if you're into country music, bluegrass, folk music, basic rock music, blues, and most jazz, boom chuck is really that accented pattern is really obvious and explicitly heard. In some pop music, R&B, and things like that, that it's not quite as obvious. It's maybe a little buried, so you have to kind of feel it out a little bit more. But again, start with feeling the pulse, just cluing into the pulse is kind of like the speed at which the beats are going by. Now, of course, again, it's not always the same as the beats, but it's going to usually be half speed if it's not the same. Okay, so that at least gets you on the right pathway, and then start trying to vocalize boom and chucks, where those accented beats, trying to determine what the count is, and then from there, follow your boom and chucks with your mouth and then with your hands here. Okay, all right. As always, I'll sign off with a little tune here, okay, for you. This is simply basic, something that illustrates what we just talked about again here. So you'll see me playing some fills and some other rhythms here, but try to find that boom chuck, all right? have fun with it, play fluently.